Hey everyone, happy Veterans Day weekend. This is Mrs. Tevis-Finn recording from Franklin. Before I get into the Progressive Era Part 2, just want to remind you to thank a veteran, maybe somebody in your neighborhood, somebody in your family. So make sure you guys do that. Let me know when I see you on Tuesday. So today we're going to learn a little bit more about how we got the government reformed during this era, the Temperance movement, which is banning alcohol, and workers' rights. So let's get right into the first slide. Look at your guided notes, guys. Remember Galveston, Texas from the previous screencast. Remember that city became a model because it organized the government, based on business principles of departments and experts. So who comes next is Robert M. La Follette, a Wisconsin Republican governor. So I want you guys to fill in his nickname. He was called Fighting Bob. And he led the fight to make government more accountable to its citizens and to increase accessibility. So guys, he changed the way candidates were nominated. Bribery and backdoor handling were often used to select convention delegates. So here's Fighting Bob pictured here addressing his citizens in Wisconsin. I want you guys to review, how the delegate system worked. So back then, guys, they were handpicked to represent their district, and then they would vote on which candidate would go to the final election. I kind of put down an example that you would understand, such as stucco. So think about in order to finalize the group of students to be eligible for election, a group of delegates from each grade would get to vote. Hopefully their vote would represent, who the class wanted, and then from that pool, the whole grade would vote on the finalist. And so it's very complicated, and there's lots of room for, playing favorites and popularity contests. And so La Follette pushed for a new law requiring parties to hold a direct primary where all party members could vote for a candidate to run in the general election. And his state was called a laboratory for democracy. His goal was to keep his citizens informed because he truly believed ignorance led to corruption. So his leadership, his strong charisma and presence, inspired change. He forced legislators to listen to their voters. And so 4 more reforms come out of this movement started by Fighting Bob. The first one is known as the initiative. And so you guys can fill in, I gave you something for each of these new laws. Initiative would be a group of citizens permitted to introduce legislation, and then it would be legislators would be required to vote on it. So here's a picture of gathering enough signatures to get the initiative brought to the attention of the legislators. So let's go on to the next one. A referendum, you guys, would allow citizens to vote on laws directly without going to the legislators. And so here's a modern day example of a referendum. So this is something that citizens can actually vote on repealing same-sex marriage. So it does not have to go to Congress, guys. The citizens can actually vote for it. Came from the Progressive Era. The third change, guys, is known as the recall. It provided voters the option to hold a special election to remove an elected official from office before the end of their term. And here's a modern day example of the citizens trying to remove a Wisconsin official known as Scott Walker, and you can see the two sides. One is going to vote to recall him, and the other's trying to keep him in office. But it's up to the voters, which is a great change that comes about from the Progressive Era. And lastly, guys, is the direct election of senators. And so originally, the Constitution ruled that each state legislator elected the 2 senators. And so this was cause for corruption because think about it, once you're elected, you can then repay your supporters that voted for you, by offering them special business favors or deals. The progressives really went after this type of corruption, and so by 1913, the Direct Election Amendment was ratified and became the 17th Amendment to our Constitution. All right, guys, the next category is moral and social reform. And so make sure you guys know temperance, is the abstinence from alcohol. And it was led by Carrie A. Nation, who was a famous teetotaler, meaning she, refused to drink alcohol based on moral principles. And so 1881 is her state, Kansas, becomes the first state to outlaw alcohol. She would go to saloons with her hatchet to destroy bottles of liquor. Here she is. She is pretty imposing. So there's her hatchet. And she would say to bartenders as she went in, her famous quote, "Good morning, destroyer of men's souls." So another way that there was social reform were the settlement houses. Social welfare progressives, mostly women, created these charities helping the poor, advocating for social reform, such as laws that would address the people's needs, such as child care or education. Jane Addams and the Hull House, here it's pictured here in Chicago, was the first that really helped inspire this movement. On to the next page, guys. Make sure you put down that it was inspired by social Darwinism. And so I put the definition down. I want you to make sure you guys understand that it was a theory. Think about biology, survival of the fittest, but it was in society. And so there would be a reason for those that were disadvantaged, or lacking in some way that makes them stay at the bottom of society. And it were these people that the progressive reformers targeted that were in need of their help. All right, so let's go on to child labor, number 3. I would put down that it was the most emotional issue of all the problems or causes during the progressive era. And it was uncovered by muckraker John Spargo. I mentioned him in the previous screencast. So his 1906 book was known as The Bitter Cry of the Children. And it told of coal mines hiring thousands of 9 to 10-year-old breaker boys. And so there were many injuries because of this. On the previous picture, this is shown boys separating slag from coal, which is just slag is the part of coal that you don't use. So here they are picked. Their job is to pick slag out, paying them 60 cents for a 10-hour day. This damaged and crippled their backs and hands. These injuries really convinced the public to pressure legislators to pass, so you guys can fill in, minimum age laws and maximum hours that children could work. Please note that this did not abolish child labor, as it was really ingrained in our farming culture. Families relied on their children to help out, and so now, so did factories and mines. And lastly, number 4, health and safety codes. Please fill in that no workman's compensation existed at this time. If you were hurt on the job, you would not receive help with medical bills. And so progressives joined union leaders to pressure states to pass workman's comp laws. And they established insurance funds. These funds were financed by the employers, and workers would receive payments from these funds if injured. Pictured here is the workman's compensation law from Wisconsin. Remember, Wisconsin was the laboratory of democracy with Fighting Bob. So here is the first one in 1911 in Wisconsin. This led to 2 Supreme Court cases because the issue was, did employers have the right to be regulated in how they demanded their employees to work, obscene hours, 12, 14-hour days. So could the state intervene and say that that was against the law? And so the first one is known as Lochner versus New York. And so you guys want to put down that the New York law was ruled unconstitutional. So there was a law that forbid bakers from working more than a 10-hour day. So that was struck down. So the ruling said states could not interfere with the, quote, liberty of employers, meaning that they could really make their bakers work as long as they wanted. Here's a exhausted baker here. Here's the larger picture of where they would work and the information from the famous Supreme Court case. On the flip side was Muller versus Oregon. And I put down a description of this ruling, which we'll talk about in class. But you guys need to know that Muller versus Oregon, what it did is it upheld the state's right to regulate hours of employment. And it was based on gender differences. It argued that healthy mothers were the state's concern. And they did say that this did not violate the employer's 14th Amendment rights to run their business however they wanted. Here's a picture in Oregon of the laundry where these women worked. And think about it. So the state could say that they could not work long hours because they were mothers, and the state had a right to protect mothers. Alright, I found a great cartoon for zoning laws and building codes. Guys, fill in, they were meant to protect the public, and they properly divided up a city into commercial and residential districts. So zoning laws, guys, this decided how the land and buildings were to be used and established building codes for minimum standards for light, air, room size and sanitation, and required fire escapes. So guys, these zoning laws, of course, were in reaction to the devastating Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, when women had to jump from the 9th floor because the only fire escape broke and the other exit was kept locked. Police and fire departments were helpless looking on as the women jumped, and the city even held, you can fill in a public morgue for the family members to identify their loved ones. And so at least these women did not die in vain, for the progressive era certainly responded and passed new safety laws for work. This is Mrs. Tevis-Finn signing off. I will see you guys all on Tuesday, and don't forget, thank a veteran.